The Brief History of American Film Special Contribution by Eszter Torma. The Beginnings. The Golden Age of American Cinema, the 1930s, the 1940s, and the film noir, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and after 2000. The Beginnings, when Harvey Wilcox bought a piece of land in Southern California in 1887 and named it Hollywood. He had no idea that only a few years later filmmakers would make this spot the movie center of the world. However, it was Thomas Edison who laid the first milestone in American cinema history by inventing his kinematoscope in 1891. In 1894, Edison presented his film Black Diamond Express to the audiences, which set the foundation of the new entertainment. The first genius in early film history was D.W. Griffith, who realized that the static camera was not enough to mediate his vision, and by starting to use close-ups, cross-cutting, fade-outs, and other camera technique, he invented movie editing. While he was also the first person to shoot a film in Hollywood, namely in Old California, 1910, his greatest success remains The Birth of a Nation, 1915, a 3-hour epic of the Civil War and its aftermath. The movie remains controversial. Movie historians acknowledge its pioneering approach to visual storytelling as well as its technical achievements, but criticize the explicit racist depiction of blacks and the glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. Among the earliest movie stars we find the impersonation of Innocence or America's Sweetheart. Mary Pickford, also Gloria Swanson, and Douglas Fairbanks, whose most popular films were The Mask of Zorro, 1920, and Robin Hood, 1922. In the 1920s, more and more people went to the Nickelodeons, the early movie theaters where the admission fee was a nickel, to watch such epics as, for example, Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, 1923. The mild climate and the year-round sunshine drew more and more filmmakers to Southern California, where the center of American film industry gradually emerged. Samuel Goldwyn, Louis B. Maher, the Hungarian-born Adolf Zukor, and William Fox, and the four Warner brothers dominated the production side of the business and established their own movie studios. The studio system was to rule the film market in the following 3 decades. The 5 major studios, or the Big Five as they were called at the time, were Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Paramount, and RKO, while among the then smaller studios we count Columbia, Universal, and United Artists. In the 1920s, a new genre, the slapstick comedy, started to gain ground in film production with such names as Fatty Arbuckle or British-born Charlie Chaplin, who eventually became his own star, director, and producer. He developed the character of the tramp, a comic but also pathetic figure in overlarge gentleman's clothes, bowler hat and grotesquely big shoes, and made several movies in this role: The Kid, 1921, The Gold Rush, 1925, etc. Chaplin kept making basically silent movies in the sound era as well, e.g. Modern Times, 1936, but as Talkie the Great Dictator, 1940, with its caricature of Adolf Hitler, was also a popular success. Chaplin's greatest rival was the stony-faced Buster Keaton, who always played the perfect scapegoat and was famous for never smiling on screen. His best film is considered to be Steamboat Bill, 1928. Besides slapstick comedies, the major genres were swashbucklers, historical films, and melodramas. Although filmmakers were experimenting with all kinds of genres throughout the decade, the premiere of The Jazz Singer in 1927 launched a new technological breakthrough, the talking picture, or talkie, with the result that the silent film had practically disappeared by the 1930s. The careers of many actors were broken as they could not live up to the demands of this new way of movie making. Among those who survived, we find Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, or Gloria Swanson. Also in 1927, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Science, AMPAS, was founded, and the first Academy Awards, popularly known as Oscars, after the nickname of the statuette given to the winners, were presented in February 1929. The Golden Age of American Cinema, the 1930s to the 1940s. The 1930s, with the appearance of the talkie, a new era of filmmaking began in Hollywood. The most popular genres of the time were the Western, slapstick comedy, musical, animated cartoon, biopic, biographical picture, etc., as opposed to today's practice. Producers, directors, actors, technicians, etc., were kept on salaries at the different studios, each studio having its own personnel. The studios also owned hundreds of theaters in cities and towns where they were able to show their own films. Big business went hand in hand with infamous relationships and scandals, and by the beginning of the 1930s Hollywood came to be known as the most sinful city. As a countermeasure, General Will Hayes introduced the production code, not enforced until 1934, to set the guidelines for films concerning sex, violence, and religion. In the 1930s also new genres appeared such as the adventure or fantasy movies. This was the time of Johnny Weissmuller's first film, Tarzan the Ape Man, 1932, which was followed by Tarzan and His Mate, 1934, and several others. David O. Selznick, one of the most famous producers of the period, introduced the first classic monster in movie history, King Kong, in 1933. Another great adventure hit came when Charles Laughton came to Hollywood after the success of The Private Life of Henry VIII, 1933, and played in The Mutiny on the Bounty, 1935. Another new development of the decade was the horror film. In 1931, the Hungarian Bela Lugosi appeared as a vampire in Dracula and Boris Karloff as the monster in Frankenstein, laying the foundation of a long tradition. The 1930s also saw the unfolding of the gangster movie genre with Howard Hawks' Scarface, 1932, and the Hungarian-born director Michael Curtiz's Angels with Dirty Face, 1938. New movie comedians also surfaced beside Chaplin. Such figures appeared as the group named the Three Stooges in Woman Haters, 1934, and they went on producing slapstick comedies until 1959. The best film of the popular pair of comedians Laurel and Hardy, Sons of the Desert, also came out in 1933. After World War I, numerous European artists came to Hollywood, Ernst Lubitsch, Alfred Hitchcock, Fritz Lang and Joseph von Sternberg among the directors, as well as, for example, Marlene Dietrich among the actors. Dietrich and von Sternberg made 7 films together in Hollywood, out of which Morocco, 1930, and Shanghai Express, 1932, are the most memorable. The greatest year in the 1930s was probably 1939, when such movies appeared as The Wizard of Oz. Gone with the Wind, winning 8 Oscars that year with British actress Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable in the leading roles. Stagecoach, directed by John Ford, one of the finest directors of the time, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The 1930s also marked the beginning of the famous feature-length animation film production of the Disney Company with the classic Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 1937. Other famous cartoons of the company were soon to follow: Cinderella, 1950, Sleeping Beauty, 1959, and 101 Dalmatians, 1961. This was also the decade when the first great stars as we know them appeared: Clark Gable, Vivien Leigh, Katharine Hepburn, Bette Davis, just to name a few. While others, for example Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, were best known for their dancing talents. 1940s and the film noir. As noted above, Alfred Hitchcock came to Hollywood to direct his first American film, Rebecca, 1940, under David O. Selznick. Among his later thrillers that became classics of American film history: Notorious, 1946, Rear Window, 1954, Vertigo, 1958, North by Northwest, 1959, Psycho, 1960, and The Birds, 1963, are considered the best by critics and fans. 1941, the year in which the U.S. entered World War II, meant shortages, blackouts, and other wartime restrictions which harshly affected the film industry. Yet, by 1946, the attendance in theaters reached the highest percentage up to that point. Many directors and producers, John Ford, William Wyler, and Frank Capra among them, set out to make documentaries and training films to aid the war. The most famous, partly propaganda film of the time was Michael Curtiz's Casablanca, 1942, starring Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman, and Peter Lorre. This dark romantic story illustrates the struggles of Rick Blaine, a barkeeper in Casablanca who has the means to save his former lover's husband by giving him false documents, while this way he would lose the woman he loves. Another successful film with patriotic flair was Mrs. Miniver, 1942, by William Wyler about the citizens of a British village struggling to survive the war. In 1941, the 23-year-old Orson Welles made his debut in his own masterpiece Citizen Kane. The film shows the life of Charles Foster Kane, who begins to fight for power within the publishing industry and turns out to be a ruthless tyrant whose actions ruin all around him. The story is mediated through a reporter whose job is to find out what Kane's last word, Rosebud, could have meant. The movie was allegedly based on the life of the contemporary newspaper magnate, William Randolph Hearst, who tried to hinder the film's appearance by all means. The film, nonetheless, became one of the greatest classics of American film history. Wells' Macbeth, 1948, was less successful, and after its release the director left for Europe, where he starred in Carol Reed's film noir, The Third Man, 1949. Film noir as a genre had its bloom in the 1940s. It expressed the dark and skeptical mood of the general public through its dark black and white pictures where lights and shadows stand in great contrast to each other, and disillusioned or corrupt characters. The first film noir to appear in the U.S. was The Maltese Falcon, 1941, which brought a turning point in Humphrey Bogart's career. Other films followed, such as Mildred Pierce, 1945, The Big Sleep, 1946, or The Postman Always Rings Twice, 1946, and the genre lived on all the way into the 1960s. In the 1940s, John Ford started to produce his most famous war movies and westerns, e.g. Fort Apache, 1948, Rio Grande, 1950. Besides the movie adaptation of such literary classics as The Grapes of Wrath, 1940. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, a paranoid fear of communism developed in Hollywood when producers, directors, and actors were expected to testify on communist activities within the industry. Many artists were accused and put on the blacklist, the existence of which has always been denied officially, and banned from working in Hollywood. The career of many stars was broken or endangered, among them Orson Welles, Gregory Peck, Katharine Hepburn, Joseph Losey, Frank Sinatra, or Charlie Chaplin, just to name the most well-known. The end of the 40s also brought the end of the studio system, which was marked by the federal antitrust action separating the production of films from their exhibition. This meant that the studios had to give up their theater networks and had to depend solely on production. The 1950s. In the 1950s, television became cinema's greatest rival. In order to keep their audiences, studios started to produce big-scale spectacular widescreen films that could only be shown in movie theaters. At the same time, as the novelty of television declined, audiences realized that it was the cinema that provided the sort of quality entertainment they were looking for, and the number of viewers began to rise again. Also, the 1950s and 60s marked the end of the production code, thus more challenging topics, such as sexuality and violence, were also allowed to be filmed. Ever since the 1950s, American films are divided more and more into two categories: blockbusters and independent films. Studios. Flop. The musical and comedy genres proved to be more successful among the audiences by this time. One of the greatest and sweetest actresses in these genres was Audrey Hepburn, who won the Best Actress Award for Roman Holiday, 1953, in which Gregory Peck acted as her well-suited partner. Her career was also notable in the 1960s when she shot Breakfast at Tiffany's, 1961, and the musical My Fair Lady, 1964, with Rex Harrison at her side. Other notable music films of the decade were the adaptation of Dr. Dolittle, 1967, also with Harrison, the partly animated Disney classic, Mary Poppins, 1964, and the by now classic The Sound of Music in 1965, both starring Julie Andrews, and West Side Story, 1961. A modern version of Romeo and Juliet in a contemporary New York setting. It was in the 1960s that Stanley Kubrick established his position as one of the most famous auteurs of the century. If his war drama Paths of Glory, 1957, was considered controversial, then his films Lolita, 1962, the scandalous story of an adult man's pedophile passion for an underage girl, or Dr. Strangelove, 1964, a dark satire about the outbreak of the nuclear Third World War, aroused even more heated criticism but also a lot of critical acclaim. His greatest masterpiece is considered to be 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968, which is widely hailed as the greatest science fiction film ever made. In the late 1960s, Kubrick moved to England and worked there most of the time until his death in 1999. One of the decade's masterpieces was Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, which already showed the weakening of the production code. Despite its graphic violence and sympathetic gangsters, the film was not banned. Similarly, Dustin Hoffman's first film The Graduate, 1967, depicting an ambiguous sexual relationship between a young man and an older married woman as well as rebellion against boring suburban life, turned out to be a popular success. The code was further undermined in the 1970s.